Wel, Prynawn da, thank you for joining me once again. Today, as usual, I want to share the very latest public health information and to set out the next steps in the Welsh Government's plan to relax Alert Level 2 measures. Now, after many difficult and worrying weeks, I'm pleased to be able to say that the situation has improved significantly. We can say confidently today that we have passed this peak of the Omicron wave and the incredibly high levels of infection we've seen across Wales. It is all your hard work and the ongoing success of our fantastic vaccination programme that has helped us through this very challenging period. Now, I wanted to begin by showing you the most up-to-date versions of the two slides that we saw last week, and they show just how quickly the Omicron wave has moved through Wales. Here is the slide that shows just how quickly the cases of coronavirus rose in Wales around Christmas, peaking, as you can see there, just below 2,500 cases per 100,000 of the population, and we now know that that happened early in January. Since then, as the model that Swansea University create for us would have suggested, we have seen an equally swift decline in numbers as we saw in that swift rise. So today, those numbers have fallen back to around 500 cases per 100,000 people. And those are the levels that we were experiencing just before the Omicron variant arrived here in Wales. But at 500 cases, coronavirus is still circulating at high levels in our communities. 2,500 people fell ill with it only yesterday. And as I said last week, we have to have some care with those figures because they're based only on positive PCR tests, and there have been fewer of those tests being taken in recent weeks. That's why we've looked at a wider range of indicators. And as you will see in the next slide, the good news is that we see a similar trend in the results taken from the ONS infection survey. In the week ending the 15th of January, the ONS has estimated that levels of coronavirus are falling in Wales, England and Scotland. You see that there at the end of the graph. Wales is the red line. So Wales has the lowest rate of infection anywhere in the United Kingdom. The rate of decline in Wales is the fastest anywhere in the United Kingdom. And if you translate that into what's happening on the ground, it suggests that 1 in 25 people in Wales on the 15th of January were infected, compared to around 1 in 20 in the other three nations. And that gap represents thousands and thousands of people who otherwise would have fallen ill here in Wales. You can see very clearly on that slide Scotland in blue, Wales in red, more or less together, heading in the same direction, and then a significant gap to England, where there were fewer protections put in place. Now, there's also some positive news about the impact of the wave on the NHS. Hospitalisations for COVID-19 can lag behind community cases by a couple of weeks, but we're now seeing falls day by day in the number of people admitted to hospital with COVID-19 and some gradual reductions in the overall number of patients suffering from coronavirus in our hospitals. But while we are over the worst, we are by no means yet out of the woods. There are still more than 1,000 people in hospital with coronavirus, and those 1,000 beds are putting additional pressures on the NHS. And while staff absences and self-isolation rates have fallen, they're still high. 7.3% of our staff are unable to be in work in the health service. And while we have now passed the peak of this wave of Omicron, very sadly, Public Health Wales continues to support significant numbers of deaths from coronavirus. In this week alone, more than 500 people have died with COVID-19, and that vividly demonstrates the human cost of this pandemic. You will hear a lot of talk at the moment about us having to live with the virus. But let us remember these 50 people and more than 9,000 other families across Wales who are living with the loss of a loved one. For them, there is no easy way to move on from coronavirus. And here in Wales, we will never forget what has happened to them. Now, we introduced level 2 measures on Boxing Day to help protect people, to keep as many businesses as possible open, and to prevent the NHS from being overwhelmed. We've been reviewing the public health situation every week to make sure we have the right protections in place to keep Wales safe during the Omicron crisis. Here last week, I set out a plan carefully and gradually to relax the alert level 2 measures as the public health situation allows. Today, of course, I'm very pleased to confirm that we have already, at 6 o'clock this morning, moved to alert level 0 as planned for all outdoor activities and events. This means that there are now no caps on the number of people who can take part in outdoor activities, crowds can return to watch outdoor sporting events, and outdoor hospitality can operate without additional protective measures such as the rule of 6. The COVID pass will still be required for entry to those larger outdoor events and will continue to be required for entry to cinemas, theatres and concert halls when they are currently open. When we announced the alert level 2 measures, we also put in place a £3 million spectator sports fund, and that was to help those clubs and sporting venues affected while they had to play fixtures behind closed doors. The first awards of just over £1 million have already been made, and more awards now will follow. I can also confirm today that, provided the public health situation continues on its current path, we will move to alert level 0 for indoor events and premises from Friday the 8th of January, a week from today. This will mean nightclubs will be able to reopen. Working from home, while still important, will not be a legal requirement. COVID passes, as I say, will continue to be required. The self-isolation rules for everyone who tests positive for COVID will remain in place, as will the face covering rules in those indoor public places and on public transport. The next review of the coronavirus regulations, including all the protective measures we have in place, will then be in 3 weeks' time. Now, the arrival of that Omicron wave before Christmas was just another unpleasant twist in this long-running pandemic. We've weathered this storm together in Wales by following the rules and all those measures which have kept us safe over the course of what is now nearly 2 years. But as I said earlier, sadly the pandemic is not yet over. Coronavirus is still with us. But we can, on the basis of what we've seen over recent days, look forward to the future with renewed hope and with better and brighter days ahead of us. We're moving back to alert level 0 while retaining some of those day-in, day-out protections that give us all confidence to lead our daily lives. Next week, the Education Minister will be here at this podium on Tuesday to set out the next steps that will be there to go on protecting our staff and our students in schools. I want to thank everyone for all their efforts over these difficult weeks to help bring this Omicron wave to a swift end. I particularly want to thank all of those who have played their part in the fantastic vaccination programme, which has done so much to boost our protection against this awful virus. Remember, as I say every week, it's never too late to be vaccinated here in Wales, whether that's your first dose, your second dose, or your booster. Let's keep on keeping Wales safe together. Diolch o galon I chi gyd. As ever, I'll now take questions, and as ever, all the answers will be broadcast live on the Welsh Government's own social media channels. Today, the first person to ask a question is to go over to Jenny Rees at BBC Wales.
Good afternoon, thank you. Given the cases are coming down so dramatically, what are the reasons? Why wait to remove those remaining restrictions, particularly for things like indoor hospitality? And if I can get that answer in Welsh as well, please.
Well, Jenny, what we are doing is following the same pattern that we have throughout the pandemic, following the advice that we have from our Chief Medical Officer and our scientists, who always say, if you're lifting measures, you should do it step by step so that you can continue to observe the data, make sure that what you're doing is not causing things to move in the wrong direction, and then when you are satisfied that you can move on to the next stage. We've known almost since the start of the pandemic that doing things outdoors is less risky than doing things indoors. That's why we've moved on outdoor activities and events today, and we'll wait one more week in order to be sure that it is safe to lift those restrictions indoors for indoor hospitality and other events. It is that considered, science-led, step-by-step approach that we think has helped to keep Wales safe throughout the pandemic, and we don't intend to depart from what has been a successful formula for us. Wel, be ni'n neud yw jyst I bwrw mlaen yn yr un math ni wedi ymdopi trwy'r pandemic I gyd, cam ar ôl cam, mynd ar ôl y gweinyddiaeth ac cyngor clinigol sy'n dod ato ni. Ni wedi gwybod trwy'r y pandemic bron I gyd, I wneud pethau mas yn yr awyr agorad yn saffach na wneud pethau tu fewn. Dyna pam ni'n symud heddi I codi cyfyngiadau am pethau tu fas. Bydd un wythnos arall o'r data I bod yn glir, mae'n saff I wneud yr un peth, I mynd lawr i'r lefel rybydd 0 pan ni'n wneud pethau dan do. Dyna'r y ffordd ni wedi wneud pethau yng Nghymru yn ofalus, cam ar ôl cam. Mae hwnna'n wedi helpu ni trwy'r pandemic I gyd, I cadw ni gyd yn saff, a dyna beth ni'n mynd I dal I wneud nawr ac yn y dyfodol.
Thank you. And then how much longer will lateral flow tests remain free of charge? Again in Welsh as well, please.
Well, we're well placed in Wales to have a strong supply of lateral flow tests. We used fewer of them earlier in the pandemic when we didn't feel that their use was likely to contribute to keeping people safe in Wales. So our supply is secure. The funding decisions are ones made by the four nations together. It's very important for me to emphasise this is not a decision for the UK government to make alone and then to announce it to the rest of us. This is money that has been retained by the UK government that would otherwise be in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, which they spend on behalf of all of us. And let me say, as I've said many times, they have done a good job of securing a supply of tests, PCR tests and lateral flow tests. If the UK government is contemplating charging people for those tests in future, that is a decision that should be made by us all. I've seen no proposition of that sort. There's no piece of paper, there's no agenda item that tells me that that is imminent. But as I say, the key thing for me is that is a decision for the four governments collectively, not one that we hear about after it's been made. Wel, ni'n lwcus yng Nghymru, mae digon o'r profion lateral flow da ni, achos dyn ni ddim wedi defnyddio nhw ar yr un lefel a Lloegr yn gyngharach yn y pandemig. So mae digon da ni a hyn o bryd. A beth pwysig i ddweud yw, os mae penderfyniadau yn mynd i gael ei wneud i tynnu nôl o roi nhw rad ac am ddim i bobl, mae hwnna yw penderfyniad i'r pedau'r llywodraethau dros y Deyrnas Unedig i wneud dy gilydd. Ar hyn o bryd, mae Llywodraeth y Deyrnas Unedig yn cadw arian yn ôl o'r Alban, o'r Gymru, o'r Gogledd Iwerddon i prynu profion a rannu i gyd. A maen nhw wedi bod yn llwyddiannus a wneud hynny. Os maen nhw'n eisiau awgrymu i symud o'r system presennol, a beth pwysig yw i cael pob un ar y bwrdd dy gilydd i weld y tystiolaeth ac i trafod y mater. Nid i feddwl lan iddyn nhw yw i wneud y penderfyniad a just roi yr ymateb i ni gyd. Jenny, thank you very much indeed. Over to Adrian Masters at ITV Wales.
Thank you, First Minister. The Prime Minister says he doesn't intend to renew the Coronavirus Act when it lapses on March the 24th. It's a UK Act and emergency powers have flown from that. Do your emergency powers rely on that Act? And if so, will they also lapse on March the 24th? And to be specific about that, does the legal requirement to self-isolate lapse in Wales on March the 21st?
Well, Adrian, my recollection of all of this is that the regulations that we have made in Wales have not relied extensively on that UK Act. What we have used are powers available to us under the Public Health Act of 1984. That's where we root the measures that we have put through the Cynhadledd on gatherings and events, on the COVID pass, on face coverings, the need for businesses to take reasonable measures to minimise the spread of coronavirus on their premises, and so on. So I don't regard the fact that an act may lapse in the UK at the end of March as having a significant impact on our ability to do the things we need to do, because it's other legislation that we have relied on during the pandemic.
Thank you. As you know, in England, most restrictions come to an end next week. Presumably the UK government is acting on the same advice that you've received, or similar advice to that which you've received, because it's all pooled, as you've told us over the last couple of years. It hasn't come out of nowhere. In other words, then, have you received the same advice that it could be safe to ease more restrictions more quickly?
No, the advice we have, and we published it. You'll have seen what the Chief Medical Officer said last Friday and what our technical advisory group have said. They said that there was some scope for us to move ahead on lifting some of the measures where those measures related to activities outdoors, but that we should continue to take a more precautionary approach to have a longer run of data before we could be confident it would be safe to lift those measures indoors, and that is exactly the advice that we have followed. That's why you saw that staged process, outdoor events, restrictions being lifted today, hoping to do that this time next week for indoor measures. That's the advice that we have seen. And as for the UK government, Adrian, let me just say, if anybody believes that their announcements this week about coronavirus were the result of a careful consideration of the science, or because they had a well-worked-out plan for what they were doing, I think that would be a very optimistic view indeed of the state of play in the UK government. Everything that is happening in Westminster at the moment is seen entirely through the lens of how can we get something else to be reported other than the dire difficulties that the Prime Minister has created for himself. And that's what I believe lies behind the announcements that we've seen this week. Adrian, thank you very much. Over to Dan Whitehead at Sky News.
Thank you, First Minister. Just following on from some of the questions in regards to the easing of measures, and specifically on the COVID pass, you'll know that it's being removed as a legal requirement in England next Thursday. Is it your aim, or at least your hope, that you will remove the necessity for the COVID pass in Wales at your next review in 3 weeks' time? And if not, then when?
Dan, we will definitely review it as part of our review on the 10th of February. So it'll be on the table together with other remaining measures at alert level 0. 3 weeks is a very long time when you're dealing with coronavirus. If things continued to improve at the rate that we have seen them improve in the last week, then there would be an active debate about whether or not the COVID pass was still a proportionate part of the measures that we would want to have in place. But none of us can be certain that the very rapid falls of this week will continue over the next 3 weeks. So we will do what we always do. We will look at the measures, we will ask for advice. The advice will be, given the public health position in Wales, is the COVID pass still a necessary and important part of our defences? If the answer is yes, we will continue with it. If the answer is things have improved to the point where it's no longer a necessary part of those measures, then we'll respond to that advice as well.
Thank you. And just on events in Westminster over the last week or so, you told Sky News this morning that the UK government is frozen because of Partygate. Can you expand on what you mean by that? What impact it has on the Welsh people when it comes to non-devolved issues? And also, is the solution a change in leadership to move on from this? And lastly, should action in that case be taken before Sue Gray's report next week?
Well, 3 questions there, Dan. So the first one is that everything that goes on in Whitehall and Westminster at the moment for the UK government is seen exclusively through the lens of how does this make a difference to the efforts that are being made to shore up the position of the Prime Minister. That's the only thing that any decision is being looked. That's the lens that any decision is being taken through, and that means the government is simply not functioning. It is not functioning as a normal, ordinary government, discharging the responsibilities that fall to it in managing the economy, in taking the everyday decisions that governments have to make. This is a government that at the moment is simply not capable of doing the ordinary business of government in a competent and sensible way, because it is overwhelmed by the headlines that surround the dreadful events that went on in Downing Street. I don't focus myself on the fate of a single individual, because the Labour Party, my party's position on that, has been completely set out by the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. We've come so close to the Sue Gray report now that I don't imagine that there will be any movement at Westminster until that report is available. So I'm not expecting there to be any dramatic moves before then, but that report is imminently expected. Dan, thank you very much. Over to Abby Whittick at Wales Online.
Good afternoon, First Minister. As you know, people will be making decisions next week about going to watch the Six Nations in pubs and at the stadium. What would your advice be to them before they do that and when they're there?
Well, the rules will allow that to happen, certainly to attend the game, and hopefully by Friday of next week we'll be in a position to confirm that pubs and restaurants and other parts of hospitality will be fully open. So there will be no legal reason why people should not make those decisions. We'll still ask people to think those decisions through, to do the sensible things, to take a lateral flow test before you go out to make sure that you're not going to be spreading the virus to others, to wear a mask if you are in crowded indoor public places, to think about the people you will be meeting and mixing with so that you're not putting yourself or other people at risk. But those are the questions that we have become very used to asking ourselves over the course of the pandemic. Coronavirus won't have gone away, so while those things will be possible, you'd still be asking people to go about them in a way that is responsible and which thinks about their own welfare and the welfare of others.
You mentioned masks there, and of course in Wales we will be required to wear masks indoors in pubs and so on. That's changing in England next week, as you know, and it will no longer be law, but will be advisory only. When do you envisage that easing to happen in Wales? And when that does happen, will you continue to wear a mask?
Well, we will review it on the 10th of February, because it's part of those alert level 0 measures. And as I said in an earlier answer, the question we ask for advice on is, are those measures still necessary and proportionate given the state of the virus in Wales? And if the advice is things are so good, you don't need to have them in place, we would respond to that advice. If the advice is they still form an important part of the defence that we can mount together, then that is what we will do. I think there will be many people who, on an advisory basis, finding themselves in places where there are lots of other people and where we know the risks are greater because you're indoors and because ventilation may not be as good as it otherwise would be. I think there will be lots of people who will choose to go on wearing masks because it gives them confidence that, that they're keeping themselves safe. And I would certainly consider that myself. Abby, thank you very much. Over to Caitlin Parr at LBC.
Thank you, First Minister. Of course, you've suggested there that the UK government are no longer actually following science in England. They're just distracting away from what's going on in number 10 at the moment. But will there come a time in the near future in Wales where we balance the risk of what seems to be becoming a milder illness now after the vaccine rollout with our own ongoing challenges, such as pressures put on public services and the economy in Wales keeping these somewhat tighter restrictions in?
Well, that is exactly the balance I think we try and strike all the time. Every time we make a set of decisions, we're trying to weigh up the different harms that come from coronavirus. There are the direct harms from it. There are the indirect harms, people not able to get treatments that they need in the health service because the health service has 1,000 beds with people who are still ill from coronavirus today, and the interests of the economy as well. These are always challenging balances. But here in Wales, we try our best to strike those balances with the science behind us and where we need to help sectors of the economy that are affected by those decisions, then as we have in this month, £120 million made available to help Welsh businesses because the trading conditions have been made more difficult for them because of the Omicron wave.
Thank you. And after everything that happened with Chester FC over Christmas, it seems to have all blown over now, but the Labour MP Chris Matheson suggested very little was actually achieved by the whole saga, and fans on both sides of the border seem to think it was just a way of political point scoring. Now, do they have a point?
I'm afraid not. The rules are very plain to see. If you have a ground in Wales, then it is the Welsh rules that have to be followed. And Chester is in that very unusual situation of being an English club where the road you walk up to get into the ground is in England, but the ground you play on turns out to be in Wales. Now, I always believe myself that there was just a sensible way of resolving that position. I'm very grateful to the club itself and to all those who got round the table and found a way through. And because from 6 o'clock this morning, there are no longer any restrictions on people attending games, where the game is in Wales and Chester's games are in Wales, then the problem has resolved itself. But Caitlin, thank you very much indeed. Over to Rod Minchin at PA.
Good afternoon, First Minister. Are you surprised, just 2 years after becoming Prime Minister, that Boris Johnson finds himself embroiled in Partygate?
No. If I'm truthful about it, the Prime Minister, who's someone who's been sacked from 2 previous jobs for not telling the truth. I think the Times wrote an editorial on the eve of the December 2019 election, pointing to the many flaws in the Prime Minister's record. And in many ways, I think what you see is his history catching up with him.
Thank you. Will you set a date for all COVID-related restrictions, including mask wearing, self-isolation, COVID passes, all that sorts of thing, to be lifted, given what England is now doing?
No, Rob, I won't, because I'm the Prime Minister of Wales, not a horoscope writer for a daily newspaper. And it's simply impossible for anybody to peer into the future with coronavirus with the sort of definiteness that you were suggesting. What I will say is, of course, the Welsh Government wants as quickly and as safely as we can to lift the level of protections that we are all living with. But somewhere in the world today, the next variant of coronavirus could be brewing. 2.5 months ago, none of us had ever heard of the Omicron variant. And yet in that period, it has swept across our lives, and now thankfully is, we hope, sweeping out of it again. When people talk about freedom days and doing things where there's no reverse gear and so on, I think they're just flying in the face of the facts of this global pandemic. We want to do what you said as soon as we can and as soon as it's safe to do so. But am I going to offer people in Wales a set of artificial deadlines, peering into the future in a way that neither I nor anybody else can know what the circumstances at the time would be? I'm not going to do that. And part of the reason why I think we have managed to sustain the confidence of the majority of people in Wales in the way the Welsh Government has acted is because we haven't been willing to make headline-grabbing promises that we've no way of knowing whether we could keep. Rod, thank you very much. Draw I Owain Evans, newyddion.
Diolch yn fawr, Prif Weinidog. Yn sgil y newyddion cadarnhaol yma heddi, pam ddim cael gwared ar y pasys Covid yn syth?
Wel, achos maen nhw'n dal i wneud gwaith pwysig I ni, I cadw bobl yn ddiogel ac I roi hyder I bobl I mynd mas, I mynd I lletygarwch, I mynd i'r cinema ac yn y blaen, achos mae pobl yn gwybod bydd pob un arall yn yr un cyd-destun wedi cael ei brechu yn barod. Ni wedi weld ymchwil dros yr wythnos diwetha, ymchwil dros Ewrop I gyd, sy'n dangos mae'r pasys Covid wedi bod yn llwyddiannus, maen nhw wedi helpu I warchod bywydau, a maen wedi cadw busnesau ar agor hefyd. A pa mae hwnna'n ran o'r pethau, ni'n gallu rhoi yn ei le yng Nghymru, pa mae'r ton o coronavirus yn dal da ni, mae'n mynd lawr, ond mae'n dal I fod ma, dydy ni ddim yn mynd I cael gwared arnyn nhw ar hyn o bryd. Ni'n mynd I dod nôl at y pwnc na ar y 10 o Chwefror. Owain just asking me why, with the numbers coming down in the way we see them, why are we not deciding to do away with COVID passes here in Wales as they are in England? And I said that our belief is that while the Omicron wave has passed its peak, Omicron is still here in Wales. I said 2,500 people in Wales fell ill with it yesterday, and thousands of people continue to fall ill every day. We're not out of the woods on coronavirus by any means yet. COVID passes do two things. They protect people's health and they help to keep businesses open. That is the result of research that has been reported this week, carried out across Europe, and I believe it's true in Wales as well. People are more likely to go to places where they know that everybody else there will have taken the same precautions as they have, either by being vaccinated or taking a lateral flow test. That helps to keep them safe, and it helps to keep people coming through the door of those businesses as well.
Diolch yn fawr, Prif Weinidog. A cwestiwn bach sydyn arall ar hyd llinellau ddigon tebyg. Gan bod y dystiolaeth nawr ynglyn ag effaith Omicron ar ysbytau yn benodol, os na ddim lle i ni edrych eto ar reolau hunan ynysu yng Nghymru, os dal angen i ni fod yn hunan ynysu am 7 diwrnod?
Wel, ni yn edrych ar y pwnc o hunan ynysu heddi. Ni wedi cael adroddiad fewn o PHW ddoe. Mae'r Prif Swyddog Meddygol yn ystyried yr adroddiad na heddi. Mae'r grŵp TAC, y grŵp gwyddoniaeth, sy'n dod dy gilydd. Mae nhw'n cwrdd prynhawn ma, a mae nhw'n edrych ar yr un pwnc. Y gobaith yw bydd cyngor o flaen gweinidogion ar ddechrau wythnos nesaf. Os mae'r cyngor yn ddweud, mae'n ddiogel i symud o 7 diwrnod i 5 diwrnod o hunan ynysu. Dwi'n siŵr dyna beth bydd y gweinidogion yn cytuno. Ond dwi ddim wedi weld y cyngor eto, ond dwi'n gwybod erbyn diwedd y dydd heddi bydd y cyngor na ar gael a bydd y penderfyniadau cael ei wneud ar diwedd wythnos nesaf. I'm just asking me about whether we intend to move from 7 days to 5 days for self-isolation in Wales. And I explained that we've had a report on that, looking at the evidence from Public Health Wales. It arrived here yesterday. The Chief Medical Officer will be considering that and will give us his advice. The TAC group, the scientific group that we have, is meeting this afternoon to give us advice on the same subject. Ministers will have that advice by the start of next week, and then we will look to make a decision. If the advice is it's now safe to do so, then I'm sure ministers will follow that advice, but I haven't seen that advice as yet. Owain, diolch yn fawr. Over to Lily Hewitson at GB News.
Thank you, First Minister. If another variant is found in Wales, should nightclubs, sports venues and the hospitality sector be ready to close down and restructure again? Or do you have faith that the booster programme will protect the people of Wales? And after the booster rollout is completed, do you see further vaccination being required from people here in Wales later this year?
Lily, thank you. I think that the first question would depend entirely on the nature of the virus. There are new variants of the virus appearing all the time in many parts of the world. Most of them just disappear by themselves. Some of them develop ability so they can outcompete the pre-existing variants. Now, we were lucky in some ways with Omicron. It was less severe than the Delta variant, and the vaccines remained broadly effective against it. Of course, we hope that it won't happen, but nobody could offer you a guarantee that there isn't a variant somewhere that will be more severe than Omicron, and where the vaccine escape would be greater. So there's no sign of that. There's no evidence of that. There's no warning in the look around the world that ministers get to see that that is actually happening. So there's certainly no need for anybody to be preparing for it actively here in Wales. But again, a responsible government cannot say to people, this could never happen, because it simply could. I've forgotten the second part of your question. Sorry.
That's all right, no worries. What I asked was, after the booster rollout is completed here in Wales, do you see further vaccination being required later this year?
Well, thank you. The JCVI will be looking at that topic. We know that the current sort of vaccines don't give you protection forever. They begin to wane after some weeks. The JCVI looked at whether it would be advisable to give another vaccine booster to very elderly people and very vulnerable people earlier in the month. They decided at that point that that wasn't advisable. I think we are preparing inside the Welsh Government, in case we have advice later this year, that a further booster programme is necessary. So we'll wait for the advice, but I have said to our officials, the sensible thing is to plan on the basis that that advice could be, we do need to, so we're prepared for it. And if we're lucky and it isn't, well, we won't have lost anything.
Thank you. And secondly, what do you think about the UK government's plans to drop mandatory self-isolation for people who test positive for COVID? Is that something you would ever consider?
I must say, I find it a very hard suggestion to follow. I don't think it is a decision. I think it was one of those, floated things in order to capture a headline. If you're releasing people knowing that they are infectious, knowing that they will infect other people, then I think that is a very, very strange thing for a government to conclude that it will be willing knowingly to sanction that. Testing and self-isolation has been a really, really important part of the way in which we have tried to prevent the worst of coronavirus happening. I would need a lot of persuasion that we were in such a benign position that you could afford to do away with that protection that right across the United Kingdom and right across the world has been put in place to prevent coronavirus from being an even worse experience than it has. Lily, thank you. We're going over today to Tyrion Davis at CJS News.
Thank you, First Minister. So restrictions are being eased 2 weeks earlier than initially planned. Is this because of the Six Nations?
No. Unfortunately, coronavirus has never heard of the Six Nations, and the Omicron wave didn't adjust itself to take account of it. You saw the graphs earlier in my presentation. The reason we are able to move sooner than we thought is simply because the downturn in the wave came earlier than we originally expected.
Thank you. And just another quick question. We've seen some concerns over the past few weeks about waiting times in A&E, especially in South Wales. Are there any plans in place to deal with these waiting times or to ease pressure on the NHS?
Well, the single biggest thing we can do is to bear down on coronavirus, because it is the pressures that coronavirus are placing on the system that has made accident and emergency departments such a challenge. Because the front door of the hospital is always open. It's one of the key characteristics of our NHS. It never turns anybody away. If you are ill and turn up at an A&E department and wait, you will be seen. The problem they have is at the back end of the hospital, we're not able to discharge people rapidly enough to create capacity within the hospital for people to flow through the system as is necessary. So the single most important thing we can do is to continue to reduce the impact of coronavirus on our hospital system, because that's the thing that will make the most difference in A&E departments today. And the pressures there are very real, and the staff that we are relying on to look after people are staff who've been doing this throughout the pandemic, and they are absolutely understandably exhausted by that experience. So there is no easy answer to it, but bearing down on coronavirus is the single most immediate thing we can do to relieve pressure in A&E, but right across the system as a whole. Tyrion, diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. Draw I Cable Darwin, S4C.
Diolch a phanhawn da, Prif Weinidog. Wrth ystyried y ffordd mae'r pandemig wedi datblygu hyd yn hyn, ydych chi'n rhagweld angen mwy o gyfyngiadau ac I ail cyflwyno brechlynau atgyfnerthu y gaeaf nesaf?
Wel, allai ddim ddweud, wrth gwrs, dyn ni'n dal I fod yn canol y gaeaf presennol. a mae'n amhosib i unrhyw person edrych ymlaen at y gair nesaf ac yn gallu bod yn sicr am beth sy'n mynd i digwydd. Y gobaith yw trwy popeth ni wedi dysgu, trwy'r raglen brechu sydd wedi bod da ni, allwn ni ymdopi gyda'r coronavirus heb mynd nôl at y cyfyngiadau oedd da ni yn gyngharach yn y pandemig. Ond, fel wedais i pan oeddwn ni'n ateb i un o'r cwestiynau eraill, dydy neb yn gwybod am beth sy'n digwydd dros y byd gyda'r amrywiolyn newydd. So mae rhaid i ni paratoi am mwy nag un posibiliadau am y dyfodol. Un ble allwn ni cario ymlaen mwy na lai heb cyfyngiadau, ond llwybr arall ble os mae rhywbeth ni ddim yn disgwyl yn digwydd, allwn ni mynd nôl a wneud popeth ni wedi wneud, ac os ni'n wneud i warchod bywydau ac i ychybu yr gwasanaeth iechyd genedlaethol. Caleb asking me whether I thought we would be in a position by next winter where we would be able to get through that period without resorting to the sorts of measures that have been needed in the past couple of winters. And I explained that we're halfway through this winter, let alone being able to anticipate what will happen next winter. But we've got to prepare for more than one future. One, a future in which, because of everything we've learned, because of the success of vaccination, we're able to manage coronavirus without resorting to the sorts of measures that have been necessary in the last 2 winters. But the possibility that further unexpected surprises, new variants could yet emerge is real, and therefore we have to prepare for the fact that we may yet need to put in place some of the measures that have helped to keep people safe and to protect the NHS when we've seen the most difficult days over the past period.
Diolch. Ac yn dilyn y newyddion wythnos yma, bod aelod seneddol ceidwadol yn San Steffan wedi croesi'r llawr ac ymuno ar blaid lafur, a byddech chi'n croesawu aelod ceidwadol y Mae Caerdydd i ymuno â chi?
Wel, allai I ddim weld neb yn y parti caedwadol yma yng Nghymru yn wneud yr un peth. Wrth gwrs, mae Plaid Llafur. Ni'n eglwys eang a ni wedi croesawu bobl o'r Plaid Cymru ac o'r Cydwadwyr ac o'r y Lib Dems hefyd yn y gorffennol. Dwi ddim yn weld ble mae pobl yn mynd i newid a'i feddwl yng Nghymru i'r un math. Caleb asking me whether following the crossing the floor of a Conservative MP to join the Labour Party in London, whether I was looking forward to welcoming Conservative Senedd members to the Labour group. And I simply said that while the Labour Party is a broad church and has in the past welcomed people from many other parties to our membership, and there is always more rejoicing in heaven when a sinner repents than anything else, I don't see myself that there's anybody poised to do that in Wales. Caleb, diolch yn fawr. Over to Tom Magna at Carers World Live.
Thank you very much indeed, First Minister. I'd like to look at the many viewers who await release of COVID-19 measures, they tell me, with anxiety and fear. Do you accept that there is a sizable section of Welsh society, the forgotten thousands, if you would like to call them, that kept themselves indoors for nearly 2 years now and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future to protect their health and that of their loved ones, no matter what easings you announced? Be interested in your reasoning.
I've got 2 of them living in my own house, Tom, so I am very well aware of the fact that there are many people in Wales who, because of vulnerabilities in their own health and circumstances, are anxious when they see the level of protections being lifted across society. And, the noise is most often made by people who would like us to go further and faster. But tests of opinion in Wales always tell me that there are more people in Wales who are anxious that we are going too quickly than there are people who think we are going too slowly. And that's not just a Welsh phenomenon. I think there was a YouGov poll out yesterday that showed across the United Kingdom, more people think we should keep protections in place for longer than we should rush to lift them. So I am acutely aware of the anxieties that causes people. It's why in Wales we will retain, even at alert level 0, those basic protections of mask wearing in crowded places, COVID passes to places where lots of people meet, and will continue to urge people to do all those simple things we've learnt, not simply because it keeps ourselves safe, but because it is a simple courtesy to other people whose own health may be more vulnerable than our own.
Thank you very much indeed for that answer. I think our viewers will certainly be reassured by your personal, the personal nature of understanding this issue. Today, sufferers of long COVID are raising issues with a group called Independent Sage, with experts, saying that the issue of long COVID isn't really being addressed. What can you tell us about the situation in Wales?
I know that it is a topic that our own Health Minister, Eluned Morgan, has taken a particular interest in. And, the approach we have embarked upon in Wales is not one of creating a small number of specialist centres, because in Wales, those are often very remote where people will live. And if you are suffering from long COVID, then long journeys are quite certainly not what you would be wishing to contemplate. Our approach has been to try to strengthen the ability of primary care to respond to people who suffer from long COVID, and then, of course, to have recourse to some more specialist services where GPs feel they need further advice or expert guidance. So that's the essential approach we've taken, trying to strengthen services close to people as much as we can, and not to expect, we want the service to go to the person, if I could put it that way, rather than the person to go to the service, particularly given the nature of this illness. Tom, before I leave you, I just wanted to tell you that I did make the inquiries that I said that I would about the register. There is a plan to publish the register on a mandatory basis in October. And people are looking at the moment at the second point you raised, which is whether it is possible to use data in the patient record to be able to populate that register. So there were some things I wanted to make sure I passed back to you on that. So
many thanks, First Minister.
Thank you too. Over to Alan Evans at Llanelli Online.
Thank you, First Minister. Your jabs there at the Prime Minister, reminiscent of Muhammad Ali. We've seen the chaos in recent weeks and months really surrounding COVID rules with the UK government. In answer to a recent question about the relationship between the UK government and Welsh government, you said, we now need a UK government capable of discharging its responsibilities rather than one paralysed by the unfolding crises of a deeply dysfunctional Downing Street. You're also on record as saying you're not in favour of independence and have said that you're convinced that being part of a larger nation in the United Kingdom was in the best interests of Wales. But you also say in the Reforming Our Union document that devolution requires consistent constructive cooperation and collaboration between governments of the UK if we are to deliver the best possible outcomes for citizens and to preserve and strengthen the Union. Regrettably, you say this has not been our experience since we published the original Reforming Our Union in 2019. My question is, if you are not confident in the relationship and the mechanisms of Westminster, as you've alluded to this morning as well, is it not time to call for a referendum on independence for Wales to let the people decide? And if you were to facilitate a referendum and the vote was yes, would you take Wales back into the EU?
Oh, wow. Well, these are very profound questions, but thank you for asking them. Look, I absolutely recognise that for people like me who believes that Wales is better off in the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom is better off for having Wales in it, then having a government that is so deeply dysfunctional, makes that argument harder to make. But I think what that does is to confuse, the temporary occupation of the seats of power by an incompetent group of people for the long-term interests that Wales has in having a successful United Kingdom. I said before the Senedd election that if a party were to win a majority of seats in an election on a manifesto that said there would be a referendum on independence, then of course that referendum independence should be held, and the people in Wales are entitled to make their own decision on their own future. I've never believed anything else. Well, the truth of the matter is that the election was won very convincingly by parties who didn't have that in their manifesto, and the one party that did have it in their manifesto lost ground rather than gained ground in the election. So it's absolutely properly a live debate. I understand why the current context draws it to the surface again, but for me, I think you've got to go in an election in your manifesto, and if you win the election, that's when a referendum is legitimate.
You've said as well that we've seen the good, the bad and the ugly from Downing Street during the pandemic. You said the positive examples stand out because we are small islands in a sea of hand-to-mouth short-termism. You also said that the pandemic has only sharpened the need for proper debate about the future of the UK. The machinery which is intended to bear the weight of intergovernmental relations has been entirely absent. Without a single meeting of the GMC since the current Prime Minister took office nearly 2 years ago. Does the First Minister take the view that it's not so much the civil service at Westminster, but a lack of effort and attention to the job in hand from the Prime Minister that is to blame? And despite criticisms over your cautious approach, you have led in protecting the interests of the people of Wales with a partner best described as divorced, with a restraining order in place and cuts to payments to the family.
Well, Alan, thank you for that. Look, there was a YouGov poll this week that showed more people in England believe that the approach taken in Wales was to be preferred than there were people in England who preferred the English approach. And that is pretty remarkable, given that they don't hear about us all that often. And when they do, they normally hear about us because we're being attacked by some right-wing politician or press outfit. Let me just put one bit of good news on the table, which is that the Intergovernmental Review has now finally been agreed. It's taken 4 years to do it, but it does offer us a much better prospect for the conduct of relations between the four nations in the United Kingdom. We will have a rule-based approach. There will be independent abilities to challenge some of the decisions that are made. The meetings will circulate around the United Kingdom. They'll be chaired by a minister in the nation where the meeting is being held. So instead of all the cards being, held in the hands and tucked close to the chest of the UK government, the new arrangements will be much more like the ones that we set out in reforming our union. Having words on a page is one thing. How you make them work depends upon, a culture and a willingness and a commitment by all four governments to it. Wales, we will certainly commit ourselves, and then we will look to the UK government to live up to the words on the page to which they have now committed themselves. Alan, diolch yn fawr. Finally today, over to Harry Henson at That's TV South Wales.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Minister. Swansea MP Grant Davis has called for measures to be taken to protect club goers from being spiked. He's suggesting that everyone should be searched and scanned before entering premises. Now that nightclubs will be reopening in Wales, is this something that the government will consider looking into?
I've not seen that. I'd need to look carefully at what Geraint has said. It sounds to me, and Harry, I'm just relying on what you've said to me, that that is more a matter for the non-devolved services, the police and so on. People deserve to be protected from the harm that spiking drinks can do, absolutely. Whether that is the right series of measures, I probably need to have a bit more time and a bit more of a chance to look at them and think them through.
Thank you. And, you mentioned it would come at the expense of the police and things like that. But would the government consider a support package to kind of help out, and especially considering the nighttime industry has been under a lot of strain recently?
Well, the £120 million that I mentioned earlier is absolutely available to people in the nighttime economy. And one final point I'd make about it is that when we devised the 120 million, it was on the basis that these restrictions would go on for longer. We didn't realise that we'd be in the position we're in of being able to lift them when we can, and the money was intended to support businesses that were closed right up until the 14th of February. Now we have decided not to withdraw any of that money. We're going to make the whole £120 million still available because we recognise that it will still take a bit of time for those businesses to get back to full capacity and full functioning. And so we will go on supporting them, even though they'll be no longer closed, but back open, we hope, as from Friday of next week. Harry, thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr I pob un.